So let's begin with the introduction to the human skull. The head and neck are anatomically complex areas of the body. So it consists of the skull, including the ear ossicles. We have the hyoid bone and the 7 cervical vertebrae. Now the skull is a skeleton of the head which is formed of two bones. We have the cranial bone and the facial bone. Now the cranial bones are a series of flat bones that are united to each other by overlapping sutures, and these sutures form a cavity which accommodates the brain. And then we have the facial bone which constitutes the rest of the skull and the mandible. Now let's see the sutures of the skull. The sutures of the skull are the joints in the skull. So we have the coronal suture, then there's a squamosal suture, the sagittal suture and the rhomboid suture. Now let's see the bones of the skull. The skull comprises of 28 bones, that is, in the brain case or the calvaria comprises of 8 bones and 6 ear ossicles, and the facial skeleton comprises of 14 bones. Let's understand the individual bones of the skull in detail. Beginning with the cranial bones. Now the cranial bones are divided into paired bones and unpaired bones. The paired bones has the parietal bone, the temporal bone, the malleus, the incus and the stapes, which are the ear ossicles. Then we have the unpaired bones, that is the frontal bone, the occipital bone, the sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone. The frontal bone. The frontal bone forms the anterior portion of the cranium and also makes the roof and the lateral wall of the orbit. So basically the frontal bone gives the shape to the forehead. Now looking at the landmarks, we have the frontal squama, which houses the frontal sinuses and is separated by the nasal septum and is located above the orbit. Then we have the supraorbital foramen, which transmits the supraorbital nerve, which arises from the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. Then there is a supraorbital margin that is located above the eye. Then there is a glabella, which is a depression between the two eyebrow region, a nasal spine, a superciliary arch, and the frontal eminence. The parietal bone. The parietal bone forms the roof and the lateral walls of the cranium. We have the sagittal suture running between the pair of the parietal bone. The parietal bone articulates with the frontal bone anteriorly by the coronal suture, posteriorly with the occipital bone by the rhomboid suture, and laterally with the temporal bone through the squamous sutures. Now the parietal bone contains no foramina but contains numerous grooves on its inferior surface for the passage of blood vessels. Then you can also see the parietal eminence. The occipital bone. Now the occipital bone is the most posterior of the cranial bones, forming the posterior wall and the base of the skull. It consists of two parts. There is the squamous part and the basilar part. It is between these parts is the foramen magnum of the occipital bone through which passes the spinal cord. Now the squamous part lies posterior to the foramen magnum and the basilar part lies anterior to the foramen magnum. Now on the inferior surface of the basilar part, just anterior to the foramen magnum, lies two projections called as the occipital condyles, which project inferiorly and posteriorly. Now this occipital condyle makes joint with the superior articular facets of the first cervical vertebrae, and it is called as the atlanto-occipital joint. Now this joint transmits the weight of the skull bones to the vertebral column and helps in making movements. Now just anterior and lateral to the foramen magnum on both the sides are the hypoglossal canal for the passage of the hypoglossal nerve. Behind either condyle is a depression, that is the condyloid fossa. Now on the posterior part of the squamous part is the external occipital protuberance, and beneath it lies two curved lines, which is called as the superior nocal line, and we have the inferior nocal line. The sphenoid bone. It is the only bone which articulates with all other bones of the cranium. So it forms the floor of the middle cranial fossa. Anteriorly, it articulates with the frontal and the ethmoid bone, laterally with the temporal bone, and posteriorly with the occipital bone. Now the sphenoid bone has two pair of wings. It has the greater wing and the lesser wing. Now these wings give the sphenoid bone a bad shaped appearance. Now the greater wing forms the floor and the wall of the middle cranial fossa, whereas the lesser wing forms the anterior wall of the middle cranial fossa. Now through the lesser wing of the sphenoid passes a canal which we call as the optic canal, through which passes the optic nerve. Now between the lesser and the greater wings anteriorly lies a fissure called the superior orbital fissure, through which passes the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. Now the most anterior of the greater wing has a foramen rotundum, through which passes the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. Now, posterior to the foramen rotundum is the foramen ovale, through which passes the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. Posterior and lateral to the foramen ovale is the foramen spinosum, through which passes the middle meningeal artery. Now, between the two greater wings lies the body of the sphenoid. Now, the body has two anterior projections called as the anterior clinoid processes and the two posterior projections called as the posterior clinoid processes. Now, in between these two projections lie a pituitary fossa which accommodates the pituitary gland. Now, both the anterior and the posterior clinoid process along with the pituitary fossa form a saddle-like structure called as the sella turcica. Now, from the inferior surface of the body of the sphenoid bone arises two projections called as the lateral and the medial pterygoid processes. In between these two processes lies the pterygoid fossa. And we have the pterygoid plates. The temporal bone. Now the temporal bone is very complex. It is a pair of bilateral symmetrical bone that constitutes a large portion of the lateral wall and the base of the skull. So it consists of 5 parts. That is the squamous part, which is the anterior portion of the temporal bone. It has the appearance of a large flattened plate. Then it's the zygomatic process. So it is the anterior projection from the squamous part of the temporal bone, and it is located on the lower portion of the squamous part. The articular tubercle. There is a small tubercle inferior to the zygomatic process at its root. Now this is the articular process. The mandibular fossa is the socket for articulation of the temporal bone with the head of the mandible. It is also present on the squamous part of the temporal bone. Then there is the styloid process, which is a narrow pointed projection that extends downward and anteriorly from the inferior surface of the temporal bone. Now the mastoid portion is the most posterior part of the temporal bone. Its outer surface is roughened by muscular attachment. Now there is a downward conical projection called as the mastoid process from the mastoid part. Now a number of muscles are attached to this mastoid process. So this includes the sternocleidomastoid muscle, the splenus capitis muscle, the longissimus capitis muscles. Then the external acoustic meatus. It is the tympanic part of the temporal bone. It is curved plate immediately below the origin of the zygomatic process. Now its concave posterior surface forms the anterior wall, floor and the part of the posterior wall of the external acoustic meatus. Now the external acoustic opening is clearly visible from this part. The ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone forms the midfacial region of the skull. The cribriform plate lies within the ethmoidal notch of the frontal bone and forms the roof of the nasal cavity. Now, as the name suggests, it comprises of numerous openings through which the olfactory fibers from the nasal cavity pass through the anterior cranial fossa. The falx cerebri is attached to the crista galli. Now, the bone consists of perpendicular plate and two ethmoidal labyrinth parts, which are superiorly attached to the cribriform plate. A smaller orbital part extends towards the orbit. Now the ethmoid labyrinths lie on both lateral sides and contain numerous little cavities with ethmoidal cells, which are referred to as the ethmoidal sinus. The labyrinths form two of the biggest structures in the nasal cavity, the superior and the middle nasal concha. The hiatus semilunaris separates the ethmoidal bulla and the uncinate process. It constitutes the connection between the frontal and the maxillary sinuses to the anterior ethmoidal cells.